Wessel, good morning, and thank you very much for your time. We always hear, of course, about when it's 16 days of activism for no violence against women and children, which is a global campaign. We always tend to focus on the girl child, but there have been calls recently that we mustn't forget the boy child. How important is the need to focus on boys?
Good morning, Dan. It's great to be on the conversation with you. Thank you so much. You know, it's a really important aspect in our fight to curb violence to consider the boy child. While girls are, in fact, according to the latest statistics, more exposed to physical violence, emotional violence and neglect than boys are, boys and girls have reported more or less the same rates of exposure to sexual violence specifically. So there is definitely a need to consider boys as being vulnerable to sexual violence particularly.
Okay. Yesterday I interviewed Rhys Mann from an organization that's focusing on the boy child. I want to play a clip from him as we start this conversation with you, and then hopefully you'll be able to hear it. Let's take a listen to what Rhys Mann told me yesterday morning.
Latest studies, the Optimus studies, is actually now set at 1 in 3 females and 1 in 3 males. That's on a
1 in 10.
1 in 3.
1 in 3.
1 in 3 boys, 1 in 3 young girls will be sexually abused before the age of 18. So the studies were rather shocking because we've been using the figure of 1 in 6 boys and 1 in 4 boys, 1 in 4 young ladies.
But you found that it's similar, 1 in 3 on both boy child and girl child. By the particular age, they would have been sexually abused.
And the problem is that the young boys, as you said, are suffering in silence for so many years. I mean, we get the young boys who are sexually abused come to our organization sometimes 20 or 30 years after the event.
That was Rhys Mann there. I don't know if you managed to hear that, Wessel. The point there was that a boy and a girl are as equally exposed, that 1 in 3 boys, 1 boy in 3, 1 girl in 3, by the age of 18 they would have been sexually abused, and that it's important therefore to manage the situation of the boy child as well as we are trying to manage the girl situation.
No, absolutely, Dan. And, you know, I'm actually referring to the same study, the Optimus study on children's exposure to violence in South Africa. What the study did show, however, was that it's important to distinguish between the types of sexual violence that girls experience and the types of sexual violence that boys experience. Whereas girls are more exposed to rape or forced sex or forced penetration, boys were more exposed to being forced to witness sex or being forced to watch sexually explicit material before they are ready to do so. What was really interesting from the same study, which I found surprising, was that children are more likely to be exposed to violence that are used by other children or by teens than they are by adults. The rates of violence used by adults against children is, of course, inordinately high, but the rates of violence used amongst children is even higher. And I do think when we think about boys in South Africa, it's important to note that the boys, as Rhys was saying, when they turn into adults, they still carry this trauma with them. And, you know, if we can, we need to avoid children being exposed to this trauma in the first place. But if they have been exposed, with the high rates that we see in South Africa, we need to have services in place where children, boys and girls, can find a way to make sense of the violence that they have experienced and how to go on with their life without carrying that trauma with them in a harmful way.
Okay, Wessel, very briefly as we end, you focus as Sonke Gender Justice on 16 days of accountability during this past 16 days. How has that campaign gone? Hashtag Be Accountable.
So, Dan, this was very much in response to the increasing focus on work with men to prevent gender-based violence in South Africa. And, you know, we as Sonke have been pioneers in this field of including men, not asking men to lead, but including men in the work that women's rights organizations have done for decades. And our call this 16 days has been to return to that, so that the initiatives like the men's forums or the men's parliament really acknowledge the work that women's rights organizations have done to lead this field, that leads to a much more feasible and sustainable response than whether men are talking on their own about solving violence. I do think it's important to include men and boys in preventing violence, but it should be seen as a part of the broader movement. Like my colleague Patrick Godana at Sonke says, there's one movement, and that's the women's movement. And as men, it's time that we join that.
Thank you very much, Wessel, there from Sonke Gender Justice.